If you're like me, when I first started crafting in Crowfall, well, what's an experimentation point? Ah, 92% seems good. You probably need some help with the basics. In this video, we'll try to clear up the process for beginners a bit and give you a solid base to start on. First, knowing how to harvest is obviously an important part of crafting as well, so I highly recommend checking out our beginner harvesting video before watching this one, and that video should pop up right about here. Once you know how to gather the resources required, establishing a basic working knowledge of the crafting system is vital, because in this world, everything breaks eventually, and nothing can be repaired. Before we get into it, I just want to take time to thank all the helpful people in the Crowfall community. The response to these videos has been unexpected and uplifting, to say the least. I wouldn't have half the information I do without help from my guild and all the vets. So, you guys are great. I wanted to take time to just express my gratitude there. If you're new to the channel, we're doing animal shelter donations at every major subscriber interval. So, we're getting real close to 500, and we're going to do a $100 donation to the Arizona Humane Society, and a special video to mark the occasion. It'll be a lot of fun. Lastly, if you're interested in a discount on a Crowfall package or purchase, just look for the URL in the description below. Alright, let's craft some stuff. I think it's important to get an idea of how the process of crafting works prior to getting into how the progression works. So, let's touch on that first. Before you start crafting anything beyond basic items, you'll need to purchase your desired discipline from the Exploration Discipline vendor. Most will choose from leatherworking, rune crafting, woodworking, armorsmithing, weaponsmithing, stonemasonry, jewel crafting, necromancy, or alchemy. Most of these are viable choices for beginners, with the exception of jewel crafting and especially necromancy. These two are more difficult to gather for, so they aren't great choices for someone looking to learn the crafting system. I should also note that stonemasonry doesn't really have a purpose beyond providing buildings and items for eternal kingdoms, so I wouldn't really recommend that either. And finally, I won't go over siege engineering or cooking because they'll be covered in separate guides. Don't stress too much about your discipline choice here. You always have the ability to unequip the discipline as long as you're in an earth temple, so choosing a discipline and finding out you don't really like it or it wasn't the right choice for your build or playstyle costs you next to nothing. You'll notice that each discipline gives you additional stats for crafting skill and experimentation. We'll get more into what that means shortly. Once you equip the discipline you want, it will give you access to advanced recipes of that discipline when you are at the corresponding crafting station, but there are some items you can craft without this discipline which may help if you're brand new. The new player experience does take you through these, but if you've skipped that portion, it's pretty important to craft an intermediate weapon and perhaps a set of intermediate armor if you've taken skinning. These items are not great, but they'll give you more survivability in your faction maps and Sky Point. So now that you've made your discipline choice, let's run through an advanced assembly and talk about what's happening as we go. Let's say we want to craft some mail boots, so we go to the blacksmithing station and open our crafting menu to find the mail boots. You can sift through the drop-down menus, or you can just use the search bar. I found the search bar a lot faster when I was new since there were a lot of things to sort through and sometimes they weren't placed in areas I had expected. So let's open up the recipe and unpack what you see on the screen. At the top you can mouse over the item icon to get an idea of what the base stats will be of the item you're crafting before your experimentation or any quality bonuses. In the middle you will see what subcomponents are required for the craft alongside which of those components will affect the overall quality of the craft. Any subcomponent in any recipe that you see with an up arrow next to it can and will affect the overall quality and or stats of the item you're crafting based on the materials you're putting into that item. Finally, at the bottom, you'll see your success chance window, which shows your assembly stat compared to the overall difficulty of assembly. Your success chance is directly affected by the skill of whatever discipline you've chosen compared to the difficulty of the assembly. Here, it is the blacksmithing skill, which is directly impacted by your strength stat. There are other factors involved, which we'll get into later, but basically the higher your strength attribute as a blacksmith, the higher your blacksmithing skill is, which in turn means the better your assembly chance is for blacksmithing items. That being said, you'll want to be informed on exactly what attribute synergizes or attributes synergize with your preferred discipline, but we need to cover one more aspect of crafting which is affected by stats prior to getting into detail on the character attributes just yet. So put that one in the back of your mind and we'll move on for now. So we need to assemble some metal scales. Find this in the ore processing section of the blacksmithing station. You'll need coal, which is the fuel category and is created by combining wood and ethereal dust. At this point, you may or may not have noticed that there are many different vendors in the Earth Temple which carry different resources. If you don't have the capability, or more so likely the time, to gather resources, then you can purchase those materials from the vendors here. On the types of scales, you'll notice a blue circular icon along the outside border of the ore resource inputs in this subcomponent. When you mouse over this, it gives a tooltip that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It just lists the various types of scales you can make with different combinations of ores, but it doesn't really say what they do. These are different types of scales which will result in different stats being added to your final item. To find out what each of these does, you'll need to reference a crafting combination chart, which is generally an external source. I assume this information will be in-game soon, but for now, you can head to Corvus Citadel's crafting chart to see which combinations do what for each subcomponent. I'll put the link in the description below. So let's assume that we want to make this set of boots with slashing damage resistance. We reference the chart for the type of combinations that give this particular stat, and it looks like that means tin, silver, and iron. Once you've got this component assembled, you'll notice that it does have that slashing bonus stat on it. This stat will be applied directly to the final product. You can mix and match these as you please, which is a really neat feature that allows you to completely customize crafting gear in terms of the stats you want to fit whatever situation you have. Do you need fire resist because you group up with jerks like this? Oh, you're gonna get him killed, you dipshit.
Oh shit! Oh shit!
Oh no. If so, the game's got you covered. Alright, let's go back to the subcomponents again and make our leather padding. Pretty much every advanced recipe requires some kind of subcomponent from a different discipline, so you're not going to find this padding at the blacksmithing station. This padding is a leatherworking item, so you've got to go to the leatherworking table. This subcomponent takes 6 hide and 1 lacing sinew. Use the search bar for sinew as it's located in the fuel dropdown, which took me a bit to figure out the first time. Once you have all your resources in, you'll notice that there's a 92% assembly chance, even though the difficulty of this particular craft is very low. This is because our leatherworking skill is very low. Our leatherworking is low because it is a dexterity attribute-based skill, and because dexterity is for sissy elves, we aren't very good at it as a Stoneborn champion. This is a great opportunity to show you how skill can directly affect assembly chance. Note our chance to assemble currently with an armorsmith disc equipped and a green quality resource input is going to be about 87%. However, if we simply switch out our armorsmithing disc with a leatherworking discipline to gain the plus 25 leatherworking skill from that discipline, we increase that chance to assemble to 100%. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of how the assembly skill levels affect the assembly chance moving forward, and how important it is to maximize your skill with your attribute distribution if crafting is important to you. Alright, now we've got our subcomponents all ready. We just slap a little magic dust in there and we're ready to go. You can see that this is not exactly a riskless endeavor. Even at max strength with these base disciplines, there's still a 22% chance for failure, but it's important to point out that failure doesn't mean it's wasted material. So what happens if I push this button and fail? Well, this mechanic has been adjusted recently, so it may change again, but currently a failed assembly only means that you must spend additional ethereal dust to experiment on the item. So you don't lose or waste your materials, you just have to spend additional materials to make it normal, so to speak. It's also good to know that on final assemblies, most items never get past a 98% chance, so no matter how high your skill is in relation to the difficulty, you still have a small chance to fail. After we've successfully finished an item, it brings up the window showing the item's current stats along with the experimentation interface. Experimentation is a way to improve items you craft beyond the stats on the item after the assembly. You can see the amount of points you have available at the top of this window, and that amount is based on your experimentation points skill. The more points you have, the better, and in this video, the amount of points we have is determined by both the attribute associated with our crafting skill and also by the quality of discipline we have equipped. Later, as you equip crafting belts, you gain a small amount as well, but we'll go into that soon. Okay, this is where it gets kinda hard to follow, and it's pretty important. Every experimentation point you have represents a chance to improve the item you just crafted by a percent. That percentage increase, or sometimes decrease, is based on a check against your experimentation skill, which is then compared to the base difficulty of the item displayed in the window. Your experimentation skill differs from your experimentation point skill in that experimentation skill is based on your intellect attribute as opposed to, say, your strength or your dex. Each of these experimentation point checks has 5 different success levels: moderate, success, good, great, and amazing, which all add additional value based on the quality of success. There are also 2 types of failures on these checks: critical and a normal failure. A normal failure does not add stats, and a critical failure actually gives a negative modifier to the stats. We get a rough idea of how successful each of these checks can be in our experimentation by looking at the bottom portion of the window. This shows your experimentation skill compared to the final experimentation difficulty. If your experimentation stats are higher than the difficulty, then you've got a pretty decent chance at positive checks. If not, you have a higher chance of failure. It doesn't really apply to beginners, but it's worth mentioning that as you increase the quality of your input items, the item quality difficulty will go up, resulting in a higher final experimentation difficulty as well. The add risk portion you see can increase the difficulty of the craft, which will also add a bonus per point, which goes up based on the amount of risk involved. We'll cover this in more detail with a later guide, but essentially the more risk you introduce to your experimentation, the less likely your rolls are to succeed, and failures on those rolls can potentially give a negative output. For now, until you have a higher experimentation skill, the community consensus is to just take no risk in this process at all and proceed with your experimentation. You can assign each point to whatever category you choose, mix and match as you please, but you must assign all of the points prior to continuing. Improving durability and armor are pretty self-explanatory, and if you choose all stats, that will give your experimentation point bonuses to the stats you see below your item on the left side, which is predominantly the stat you assign to the item with your subcomponents. In this case, slashing damage resistance. Click Run Experiment and watch the pretty colors happen. You'll notice another interface comes up giving you the option to polish for more magic dust or use a Chaos Ember to reset the stats. Chaos Embers are super rare and should not be used at this stage of crafting, and using the dust is fine if it's an item you're actually going to equip and use. If it's just an item you're grinding out, then do not waste your dust. Once you're there, click Take, and there it is, your finished item. So now that we've learned about the crafting process and the skills that govern the chances involved in that process, let's talk a little bit more about the attributes which affect the skills before we go into progression. We'll do this quickly since we already touched on it a little bit earlier. Basically, every discipline has an attribute which governs the core skill. Here, you can see exactly what those are. I will put a link in the description to our guild guide here, which has this chart so you can reference it again later. I won't go into detail on class and race selections, but I will say that once you figure out what discipline you want to do, many races have bonuses to specific discipline skills, so you'll want to find a combination that allows you to put points into your attributes which govern your crafting skills, and at the same time don't negatively impact your combat skills. In other words, trying to do blacksmithing on a dex-based character is not a great idea. Alright, moving on to progression, we're almost there. This is very similar to harvesting progression in that your main goal is to advance your discipline and belt quality by obtaining uncommon disciplines and using them to upgrade your existing one. Each time you craft a complete item of your equipped discipline, there's a chance for a discipline to drop into your inventory of the uncommon quality. Subcomponents and base components do not have a chance to drop this discipline. Only items that are complete have a chance to do this. Even failed assemblies have the same chance as a normal assembly to generate a discipline, so it's important you don't use the large amount of dust required to turn them into normal items during grinding unless you actually intend on using that item. Every item has a varying chance to drop one based on its difficulty as well as the rarity of materials going into that item. Here you can see a chart of which items are best to craft, approximately what chance they have to drop the disc, and how many it will eventually take you to get your legendary discipline. Again, I'll put this information into the description for your reference. Once you've gotten your green discipline and you equip it, this will allow you to equip your crafting belt. Once you've purchased your green belt, your new goal becomes upgrading this belt to rare or blue quality. The reason you're focusing on this prior to upgrading your discipline further is the reduced resource cost for the commonly used subcomponents related to your discipline. This makes the grind much less material intensive. For this upgrade, you're going to need to farm about 50,000 gold total for the domination dust and the additional belts in the upgrade process. On top of that, you're also going to need to grind out 9 uncommon disciplines. In our case, an armor smith having a 30% drop chance on gloves or boots means that we're going to have to craft about 40 different items. After you get this done, you can start to work on upgrading your actual discipline. Your long-term goal being getting your discipline to legendary and then going back to address your belt further. Well, that should keep you busy for a while, maybe even until our next crafting guide. I hope you enjoyed the dissertation. Feel free to message me on Discord if you've got any questions, and remember that info in the description. Good luck out there in the Crowfall world. If you see me, make sure to say hi.